And then my grandmother was like, every time an old person dies, the whole library goes with them.
Hello, print friends, and welcome to the 74th episode of Pine Copper Lime, the internet's #1 printmaking podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf. I release weekly podcasts with people in the print world who are doing something a bit beyond the expected. So please subscribe on your podcast listening app of choice. You can also find Pine Copper Lime on Instagram and Facebook, and you can sign up for our monthly newsletter with print news from around the world, all at pinecopperlime.com. We also have a Patreon page, where supporters can sign up at tiers that start at $1 a month, and you help keep Tim and I in a job and great print chats in the ears of your fellow printmaking fans. There's also thank yous like stickers and totes, and if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, check out that link in the show notes. And also, if you're not interested in that because life is tough and times are weird, just enjoy the show. And print friends, if Patreon's not your thing, but you still want to support the show, we have merch for you. We've actually just uploaded a new design with our beloved slogan, "Shun the non-believers," by popular demand. It's beautiful, it's dark, it's moody. Printmaking forever, shun the non-believers. Pine Copper Lime is brought to you by Speedball Art Products, who've been offering a diverse range of high-quality products to your creative practice since 1997. But we all know those products don't use themselves, and that's why Speedball works with a fantastic lineup of contemporary printmakers who make up the Speedball team of demo artists. Artists like Alex Carmona, whose imagery inspired by motorcycles and automobiles led him to a collaboration with Fender, which resulted in the release of the very first hand-carved woodcut Telecaster. Alex's favorite products are Speedball professional relief inks and fabric inks, which he finds to be the most consistent, easy to use, and easy cleanup on the market today. So, if you want to learn a few tricks of the trade, head on over to Speedball's YouTube channel, learn from great artists like Alex, and there's a link in the show notes to show you just how to do that. My guest this week is Danny Gonzalez. This is one of our bi-monthly bilingual episodes in collaboration with Reinaldo Gil Zambrano, and it is a perfect way to begin 2020. Enjoy this episode in which I chat with Danny about Akira Kurasawa films playing a role in his aesthetic, being influenced by the LA music scene, visiting his grandparents in rural Mexico, and the realities of dealing with the year that was 2020 and the joy to be found in a tomato plant. And if you're a Spanish-speaking print friend, head on over to Ronaldo's chat with Danny, also in the same feed. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and prepare to enjoy yourself with Danny Gonzalez. Hi, Danny. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for joining me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Well, thanks for having me.
I feel like I know your work, just as these really beautiful narrative, sometimes illustrated relief prints. And I know that you're based in LA and that you've spent a lot of time, sort of splitting your time, at least in childhood, between like Mexico and the States. But for people out there listening, would you mind giving yourself a little brief introduction about who you are and where you are currently and how it is you would describe what you do with yourself?
I'll try my best. So my name is Daniel Gonzalez. I go by Danny. But yeah, my childhood was shared between Los Angeles, in particular Boyle Heights, and my parents' hometown of Tehuil, Zacatecas. And it's a very small rural community in the high plateau, kind of in the middle of nowhere. So I had this really interesting childhood where I would go away and spend summers in this community, and then I'd come back and tell all my friends at school these crazy adventures I would have, like, basically where many animals can kill you, where you have to go milk the cow if you want to eat breakfast and mill the corn by hand, everything is like really like it's just a different way of living. You kind of have to go to the chicken coop to get eggs, and you really have to work. And then you come back, and then you share this with your friends, and they look at you like, "Oh, you're crazy." And you try to tell them like, "No, I really did ride a horse. I really did milk a cow, or tried to milk a cow. I really did kill a rattlesnake." And there's lots of them,
Oh my
so
gosh.
so it really had an impact on growing up, because I had a really strong sense of where my family comes from, and I recognize that as being something, a very big privilege, to have that strong connection to family, to place, to where I'm from, to my roots. And then I started getting into printmaking when I started going to California College of Arts and Crafts. It was called California College of Arts and Crafts when I was going to school. So now it's California College of the Arts, but they have a really great printmaking program. And I got introduced to printmaking by Professor Nancy Banyan. She gave an introduction, amazing artist as well. And from there, I just started, I got really curious, because my original course of study was going to be graphic design. And while people were rushing to take those, get rich quick internet web design classes. This is during the first tech boom in the late 90s. I was going into like print design and printmaking, and I remember a typography teacher taking us to Center for the Book, and just being so amazed by the Vandercook presses, and really curious. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to continue my studies there. Housing was really difficult to come by. So I started volunteering at Center for the Book and at the Mission Cultural Center. So my first real intensive introduction to printmaking, to relief printmaking, was Juan Fuentes over at Mission Grafica. And I just used to bug the heck out of everybody. I used to go in and ask a lot of questions. I made a lot of mistakes. But I produced my first editions at the Mission Cultural Center with Juan Fuentes. I produced my first silkscreen there, my first lino cut edition, signed and numbered. And I used to show in little cafes. And now I've come back from, many years ago. I spent 5 years in the Bay Area, and then I came back to Los Angeles, and I made a commitment to printmaking once I bought a press that weighs half a ton. I think there's there's no going back.
Yeah, that'll do it.
Yeah. So now I'm based out of Los Angeles. I continue to visit family in Mexico. I still have family there. And I think my work is a lot about that space in between, right? And, the things that happen, it's about my experience. But also, I'm not unique in that experience. I feel like my work kind of speaks to a whole generation, a whole group of people that are able to kind of travel between these two spaces, and then have these stories and these narratives. And I do have a lot of sensitivity towards nature, and I find I look for that here in Los Angeles. One of my favorite spaces to visit is the LA River, and I grew up next to the river, so I felt like that was kind of like this really secret place where it's just different, and some of that wildlife that you find in Mexico exists there, and it's like this space that really is really special, right? Because it's kind of been, it's been there forever, and it has a lot of stories, so I just that's kind of like where I've been at now. And now with COVID, I've had to kind of bunker down and make adjustments and make do with a smaller studio setup and more limited space, and but still working, and still grateful for all the work coming my way, and for being able to still to produce.
I would want to talk maybe a little bit more about the way that you described your childhood. I mean, it's so unusual, and kind of has a bit of almost a romance to it, this idea of the Los Angeles city kid, and then the country boy too, and getting to sort of live both roles and wear both hats and ride horses and kill rattlesnakes for a few months out of the year, and then go live in LA for the rest. Yeah.
So I mean, I mean, for sure, you pick up a whole different set of skill sets. Really, like, I mean, I remember like my grandparents still had old style cooking kitchens. It's kind of like going back in time, like going to where my grandparents lived and where they had there. It's a farming community, and then my grandparents live in the outskirts of that.
Mm.
So they lived in like these plots of land where they planted corn and raised cattle, both sides of my family, my dad and my mom. And we would go stay with them, and it wasn't kind of like, oh, we're gonna go and stay. And you have a room, and you have a sink, and you have a toilet, and you have. It's like, no, you wanna wash your hand, you wanna take a shower, you have to go to the river and like carry water. You wanna cook a meal, you have to start a fire in the kitchen and grind corn and help. You really have to be involved. So the mentality, like for us, is kind of like we're part of a team. You're not just like this person, this person just coming in to visit, and you're kind of like pampered. It's like, oh, you want to stay here? Well, you have to carry water, chop wood, and do these things. So for me, it wasn't like necessarily I think telling it, people imagine a romance, but living it strips the romance away out of it, so that you meet a lot of people later on in college that are like, oh, I just want to run away and live this idyllic life in this pastoral myth, out in the country. It's like, no, you don't. You don't want
Right.
to do that. Like, you're lucky that you got air conditioning and that you sleep. I mean, but it's a trade-off, right? Like we give up that connection to a lot of things, to family, to even to your food, to what you're bringing
Right.
into your body. Like you give that up for like these comforts of living in a suburban place, but also you become exposed to like a lot of different cultures and a lot of different people. It's a trade-off for sure. And my parents made a big sacrifice in coming here and starting a family and severing that, and
Mm.
for them to be able to return is a very big privilege that a lot of people yearn for, literally dying for,
Yeah.
right now. So I'm always conscious. And I always say that it's a privilege for me to be able to commute those two spaces. And I think I feel like that it's a calling to kind of like tell not just my stories, but the stories that are around me, and put them down on paper.
Right.
So, so there's definitely that drive, right? It's always
Hmm.
in the back of my head that I got to put that down somehow, somewhere. And for me, it was printmaking. For other people, it's writing. For other people, it's another medium. But for me, it was printmaking.
I think that really kind of speaks nicely to one of the questions that I had about your work, which is that it has this sense of being a traditional aesthetic, but it also feels completely contemporary in its content and even sort of the use of composition. But it's very clearly has roots to that the quote unquote like the traditional relief Mexican printmaking look. Was this something that you were exposed to as spending summers in Mexico, that style, or was it something that you were just drawn to kind of just generally out in the culture? How did you come to it?
When I started doing making prints, they were very crude, and they were very like I was trying different ways of putting the image like onto linoleum, right? And then over time, in particular, like Juan Fuentes, he started showing me like the work of Leopoldo Mendez, of Beltran, Mora, Elizabeth Catlett,
Mm-hmm.
and it just started. I saw it, and it was just like, for me, it was amazing, and it's a great way of telling a story. So not necessarily during my youth, well, during that my formative part of my of stage in my life, when I was trying to put down like a style, I started looking at it, and I felt that what was missing is kind of like, wow, this is a great vehicle to tell my story, or so that when I started creating these prints and I would show them in Mexico, people were drawn to them because they look very much like that style from the Taller de Gráfica Popular, and they were drawn to it, and they thought people would think at first glance like, oh, here's another artist that kind of like makes images like these guys, and it's probably another Pancho Villa or another
Mm.
Zapata portrait, and they take a closer look and no, it's actually a city, or no, it's actually not that the expected, right? It's kind of like I'm telling a different story, and it's telling it from my point of view, and my compositions are very influenced by film. I love films,
Hmm.
I love movies. I love looking at. For me, like I grew up watching this program here called Samurai Theater on Saturday mornings, and they would show like these kung fu movies. But I remember I saw a black and white samurai movie, and I think it was Akira Kurosawa. It was an
Yeah.
Akira Kurosawa movie, and from then on, it's just like I searched him out more and more and more, and then just looking at that, at the way that he framed his shots, and looking at the way that he built the story, the how he just captured like kind of like this uneasy stillness, and then he would record something moving like the grass. So for me in my work, like the sky is always like turbulent, or like I try to put that in my own work. Like rather than the sky being a flat plane, I want you to see the Santa Ana winds maybe blowing
Hmm.
through. I want to see the grass blowing over the LA River or over the hills. Like I want you to kind of get that sense of movement, just kind of also like the way like Van Gogh does Starry Night, where the sky is like just swirling. I want to get that into the image, rather than have it something static. I wanted to get it to move. So one of the things I looked at was very much movies, and in particular, Akira Kurosawa for sure is one of the guys that I look to, and of course Gabriel Figueroa, as well, like that whole black and white movies from that época de cine de oro, época de oro, is very much influences my work as well.
What's interesting is hearing you say that. I can't help but think about how the fact that a lot of the, classic 60s, 70s westerns with, Clint Eastwood, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, some of those are almost shot for shot refilming of Kurosawa films. And some of
Yeah.
those, of course, take place in the Mexican desert or in the borderland. So I wonder if there's something about like the drama of the landscape, or just that the stories of people kind of out on their own trying to make it, that there's just like maybe like a natural energetic or emotional sort of connection between the drama of that kind of storytelling and the drama of the beauty of the landscape in that part of the world. I don't know.
Possibly. Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And then so when you were, growing up and you were like in LA, obviously, which is super vibrant, known for the arts, all of that. But what about like when you're in this countryside? Was there a sense of art? Was there music around? Or was it really just, again, this might be my never having lived it, so I can still have some romance about it point of view. But was that something like visual culture? Was it present, or was it really just more about like, look, I don't have time for that. I'm grinding the corn right now.
I mean, I think as human beings, we tend to look back. Our hindsight softens the rough curves of
Hmm.
the lived experience, right? So we live it, and then we forget like how uncomfortable and how rough it was, and then we think back to it, and some of those edges are lost. So I think naturally, like some of that kind of like sneaks back into my work. But as far as like LA, for me, man, music for me is like, always, it was always around me. It was, I sought it out. I seek it out still, you know online now. But for me, it was just kind of like air. I need it around me, and I respect it so much that I'm not going to attempt to make music myself, because it would just be mediocre. I'm going to share something. I tried. When I was very young, I tried. I got hooked into taking French horn lessons
Oh gosh.
when I was a kid at the Bow Heights neighborhood school, and I got a chance to meet Tito Puente
Oh my
with
gosh.
my brothers one day, and he talked to us. Like, we were cute young kids, and he came over
Yeah.
and he tells us, "Hey, you kids, you play any instruments?" And my little brothers ratted me out. They're like, "Oh, he does, he does." And he asked me like, well, "What do you play?" And I was like, "Well, I play French horn." And he looked at me with kind of like disdain. He's like, French horn ain't got no jazz." And he chuckled and he moved away. And then he killed the dreams of a young French horn player. And they never went back.
I mean,
but no, but
yeah, if you're gonna get it killed by someone,
Yeah. No, totally, right? Like it has to. So for me, the music culture in LA really feeds my soul, and it's brought me a lot. Like it's taking me places, and I feel very privileged to being able to call. Many of my friends are musicians, and I'm just honored by their friendship and their generosity because they allow me to come into some amazing experiences. Just them. I'm able to be a fly on the wall, like as they're having these amazing like performances, and just kind of like sharing these ideas and putting together like these projects, and I just love it, just because you get to hear, you get to see the process, but then you get to hear how they build it. And for me, it just kind of decorates maybe like the narrative that I'm building inside my head, right? It pairs the image with some kind of music. So as I'm working, I'll listen to music, not always, my friends, but music is a big part of my process, definitely. So again, I guess maybe some of that romance does sneak in as I'm looking back and then putting down a soundtrack. So.
Yeah. Well, I remember looking kind of at the work on your website, and it did. Am I remembering that there are some sort of gig poster, something about like Dile de los Muertos Morsi, something like that?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I'm a printmaker, and I also I like to call myself a graphic artist or a graphic storyteller, but yeah, my part of my practice is like, I do I've done gig posters. And it's something that I enjoy immensely. And I did have like the privilege to, I grew up being a big Morrissey fan. And that's a whole other show. It's like, why is a Chicano kid from Bullhide to Morrissey fan? To be continued. But anyways, I did get to make that really cool poster, and there's a lot of storytelling in that poster. If you look at the image, the skeletons are holding Guy Fawkes masks, and that's because the date of the concert actually fell on Guy Fawkes Day. And the theme of the concert was Day of the Dead, so it's a scene from The Wild Ones, and that night was just amazing. It was right before the election in 2016. Oof. And Morrissey says, these are, you're going to look back and you're going to think, these are the good old days, And man, was he right.
Oh my gosh. How prophetic is that?
Yeah. And so I've done that. And then, I had a chance to kind of do just a crazy opportunity to sneak in some political messaging. They didn't have any background graphics for like the bands in between. So I created some of those, but then also they needed like a 3-minute video to show before the next band showed up. So I told them, could it be anything that I want? I'll do it for free, except I need some creative license, and it's going to have a political message. I'm sorry. Like, it's just too good of an opportunity, and for you guys, it's too big of a favor. Like, it's motion graphics, and my friend, another print maker, Ernesto Llerena, I asked permission to use his poster for the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. He said, yeah, sure. He didn't even ask me like what I was going to use it for. He's like, go for it. So we set up a call to action right before the Morrissey show.
Oh my gosh.
Because of that, through that project and through that poster and through, the generosity of Ernesto, and also a tribe called Red lending us their song, a Stadium Powwow, to use as a soundtrack to that. We sent out a call to action, and then Morrissey came out, and I don't know if this was his plan all along, but he dedicated the whole show to the protesters in North Dakota.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, that was a crazy time. But yeah, a lot of things kind of overlapped through that poster, and beyond that, I think I started doing other things with my printmaking tools. I started making papel picado, which is like a traditional, like people call it a folk art, but it's an art form itself. It's like tissue paper punch cuttings. We might have seen them like at cafes or like at parties, like Mexican themed parties.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a whole different way also of communicating through color and through pattern and design. And it's the same tools that you use for relief printmaking. I sharpen them and I turn them into tools to punch these stacks of paper. And I think maybe I felt like stabbing someone, and I just decided to stab these paper, because it really did feel like, I mean, more so now, but back then it was just kind of like I knew what was coming. Like I knew like that this, and I needed to channel that in a positive way. Sorry, that sounded really creepy. But,
no. I mean, I think
I
that
needed to stab someone.
Yeah, I think that if the 2016 election didn't, incite such feelings in you, I don't know. Like, I don't know if we have anything in common. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So I'm thinking about, listening to you, just not only seeing your work, but just like listening to you talk, I'm realizing that like you're such a storyteller, like, and like even like the way that you speak about things is in this really beautiful kind of illustrative way. And I was thinking about what you said a little bit earlier about how you just had this drive to tell stories, and either drive to tell the stories of your childhood, or obviously other stories as well. And I guess I'm wondering if you know sort of where that comes from. And you said that other people tell it through music, or other people tell it through writing. And why do you think like you were sort of drawn to that, and why printmaking out of all the things ended up being the vehicle for you to do it?
Well, I definitely get it from listening to my grandparents. When I turned 18, I made it my goal to visit my grandparents while they were still alive once a year. And I wonder like how I did it sometimes, because I was very much a starving artist in the Bay Area going to college. But somehow I always made it. I always made it to there. And I spent a lot of time with my grandparents and my grandmother, and listening and listening to how they speak and how they tell their stories. And that definitely influenced me. Also listening to my parents. I mean, naturally they inherited some of that.
Mm-hmm.
But my mom tells me that her brother used to go to the movies. And then since they couldn't all go to the movies because they all couldn't afford it, and the movies is like a sheet and like an old projector, and probably like a very old movie. He would come back home and he'd tell everybody, he'd describe the movie to everybody, and they would listen, kind of like listening to the radio. And the way that he described it was so good, it was almost like you were watching it, So there's definitely that in my family. And how I landed into printmaking, it was really, it wasn't planned. I used to paint. I used to, I worked on murals. I used to do murals. I used to do easel painting, and I had access to these tools through like community arts programs. And once I moved into college, materials are expensive, so. And I was always moving. I could never secure like a space in the Bay Area for the life of me. Like it was just nuts. I was going from like sublet to sublet, and I had to move a lot. So printmaking didn't require a lot of tools, some ink, rollers, cutting tools, paper, and linoleum to cut into, and it's stored flat. I could stick it underneath my bed.
Yeah.
And I can move. The presses I would use at Mission Grafica, or I would actually sneak into the studio. I'm going to confess something. I used to sneak into the studios at CCAC because it used to be an open campus, and the guard would if you had an ID, they would let you in pretty much anywhere.
Yeah.
And I would tell them like, yeah, I'm going to go make some prints. But I really just went in there to mug things up and like do my own style of learning, which is by doing.
Yeah.
And I don't think I broke anything. I was pretty respectful of everything, but I think eventually people started noticing that someone was coming in to using the space that didn't quite know how. But that's how I made my first editions, was getting access to these spaces like that. And for me, like I just continued, I continued. like I continue doing that because the process of printmaking involves so many different things. Like I get to be an engineer working with this machine.
Mm-hmm.
I get to be like a sculptor carving into these spaces, and almost like an archaeologist. Like you're revealing something as you're like picking at the surface. You're bringing light into like this darkness. I don't like to really like. I know some artists like to have a very defined way that the image is going to look, and their drawing are super intricate. I like to kind of just make like the gesture, and then as I'm carving, I fill it in. I pull out the form by bringing in that light, and
Mm.
that for me is just like, for me it's just wonderful, like, because it's almost like you're shining a light into a dark room, and then like the shadows are going to reveal the object, right? And your job is to kind of like, okay, how much light are you going to pull out? Do you want to cast into that? And for me, it was just mentally stimulating,
Yeah.
and I could never get bored. There was always like something. I had to oil the machine, I had to prep the machine, I had to lay out the ink, I had to carve so for me, like that was just like it, like man, and then I can make multiples. That's so cool. And then it's tied into kind of like what I was studying, graphic design, in a very direct way.
Mm-hmm.
Printmaking and graphic design, go hand in hand. And
Yeah.
then printmakers are troublemakers, man. And I'm like, like I'm in my own way, depends on who you ask. I'm a troublemaker. like I always want to instigate people to kind of like think beyond themselves. Maybe think beyond your day to day, and consider different things. Consider, even if it's just a sensibility to like an art, or sensibility to like something creative. I feel like, okay, I've achieved something through my work. You don't necessarily have to get the story, but really, just at the end of the day, if I could instigate like a reaction,
Mm.
I'll count that as a success.
It's reminding me of what you're saying. It's this thing that I rarely do on the podcast, which is to like quote an artist statement back to them. But you wrote on your website something I thought was particularly lovely that I thought I would just read and then maybe ask you to
Oh,
speak about it more.
uh-oh.
Yeah, exactly. I'm holding it against you. You got to. You got to hold
Yeah,
on to it
yeah,
now. But what you wrote was, my work records through images these stories and events that have shaped my life, but also touched on the allegorical and universal experiences shared by many. Stories that transform space into place and give meaning to our existence. Stories grandmothers tell of guardian angels by bedsides and of devils dancing on rooftops. Stories of hardship when past things seem dark and uncertain. All these narratives are important, and they touch on history as well as on the impact of politics, ecology, and unrest in our society. I just thought that was such a beautiful way of talking about how we just seem to be telling ourselves the same stories over and over again, And so you're looking at these like sometimes ancient stories or just family stories, but they often are holding the same messages, about being
hmm
kind to each other, or politicians are corrupt, or, memento mori, like don't forget, like that live your life as if you were dying because you are, these kinds of big ideas. And I would love just to hear you kind of like maybe talk more about that, or the way that you see that the art that you make fits into that kind of task and that narrative, because I definitely see that it does. And I think it's just, a really beautiful way of talking about stories that we tell each other and we tell ourselves.
Wow, that's gonna be like that's a big answer.
We got
It's gonna
time.
take me. Yeah, I got time. I mean, for me, that statement, I was just thinking of like all the stories that my family have told me, in particular grandparents, listening to grandparents, telling these crazy stories of like of the life that they lived, and the times that they lived. And then my grandmother was like, every time an old person dies, the whole library goes with them.
Mm.
And and there's a lot of different, and I looked into it, and there's a lot of different ways of like there's a lot of different quotes that kind of like touch on the same thing, right? But I don't know where my grandmother got that from. But she shared that with me because I always had an interest in like what she had to say, and like the life that she lived, and she always thought it was kind of weird. But that when she said that, I was like, that just kind of like put a fire under my butt and said, okay, well, you're listening, but how are you recording this so that it could get passed down, or shared, or how are you recording this so that there's something left behind after the words and the person who speaks them are gone. And my craft isn't wordsmithing. There's a lot of people that do it much better than I do, that I could. So what is it, I settled on printmaking, and it's just listening, and it's also listening and knowing when to kind of like sit back and just empower people maybe to tell their own story. Like, you don't have to be the guy that, or the gal that does it. It's just kind of, I know, having a kind of like this respect to the knowledge and that's getting given to you, or that you, and acknowledging that maybe this is for you to keep for yourself, and knowing when it's something that you can share, or maybe something that you learn, and maybe you need to help somebody else share it, because maybe their experience is more, more rooted into to a different reality than from what you're seeing, just kind of how you mentioned like the romance of the countryside. Yeah, of course, but it wasn't always like that. Then the same goes with a lot of other people. So maybe I'm wanting to maybe like show you like the tip of a thread and have you follow it on your own, or maybe I'm helping that person like find that tip, and maybe having them follow it into telling their own story, and shaping their own narrative in whatever the way they can. Maybe it's through visuals, or maybe it's through writing, but definitely that's kind of been my goal. And when I said to write that down, I had that in mind, like what kind of what got handed down to me, and it was definitely those stories, right? Yeah, right now for me, like my we're all collectively going through this crazy experience of a pandemic, and it's hard to see a way out because it looks so hopeless.
Yeah.
And for us, I think right now we have to look into the times that our ancestors went through. Same kind of like feelings, but different situation. But they saw their way through it, and they saw their way out, and we're testament to that. We're here, we live beyond that moment, So, and yeah, like how do you remind people of that? How do you bring people to be mindful of that? And I'm always thinking about that. I'm always thinking about the crazy times my grandparents lived through.
Yeah.
They lived through two revolutions. They lived through the Revolution of 1910. They lived through the Cristero War. They lived through a pandemic there too.
Yeah.
And a lot of violence, and they lived to tell about it.
Yeah, and world wars, and
world wars, yeah. World wars, and different things. So
yeah, that's something that I was thinking about as well when the pandemic started, and I was lucky enough to be living in Australia at the time. That overall Australia had done just incredibly well, and in terms of keeping cases low and supporting people, and so I was. I felt pretty safe, and it was a lot of uncertainty because, of course, nobody knew what was going to happen. Like, how bad is this going to get, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember sitting at home and thinking about this story that I think my mother speaks French, and she was working on translating some letters for a friend that were that friend's mother's letters of her time in Nazi-occupied Paris. And that she would do things like, I don't know if it was move letters or maybe move even like guns across checkpoints. And what she would do is she would hide them underneath her lingerie in her suitcase because the young Nazi soldiers were too shy to move her under things to look underneath them. And so she'd be safe, relatively safe, moving these things for the resistance across checkpoints if she just, put it under her underwear. And I just remember thinking, like, the bravest thing I've ever done in my life is like run a red light in front of a cop. Like,
Wow.
you know what I mean? There are people who were alive, like, in the same time that we were, you know, like just two generations before us, who were doing these things, like risking their lives, moving things across Nazi checkpoints. And I'm just being asked to stay home, you know? And
Right.
it really does put things in perspective in this sense of it's the most dramatic thing that's happened to most of us, at least on a global, you know, if not necessarily a personal level. And so it feels huge. You know, it feels like this is the biggest thing that's ever happened to anyone. And just a few of those narratives, a few of those good stories from generations past, it really does, help put things in perspective. And you're like, I guess I can eat cheese doodles and watch Netflix for the good of the people. Like, you know.
Right.
Yeah. Speaking of sort of just storytelling and narration, you've also done illustration for books as well, or for
Oh yeah.
stories, like quite a bit. And I'm hoping you can speak to that process a little bit and just how you decide what is going to make a compelling image and how you go about actually making illustrations that really work well with the text.
So I mean, I'm gonna mention like the I guess the largest project that I've kind of worked on that comes to mind right now, and it comes to mind because I just thought, we just had a physically distant meeting with my friend Tim DeRoche. He wrote a book called The Ballad of Huck and Miguel that takes place in the LA River, and it's a retelling of Huckleberry Finn. And he wanted to have someone create the images that was familiar with that space and familiar with the story, and the slant in the story, like, was that Jim in Huckleberry Finn is black, but in the Ballad of Huck and Miguel is actually an undocumented person. He wanted someone that could kind of, like, you know, build that narrative. And I think the key for a successful collaboration, because it very much is a collaboration, creating like an images for like a text, is kind of being able to set egos aside and agree that our goal is to tell a good story and not necessarily impose your will on the other, right? And really listen to each other, and have that be your goal is to, like, you know, really make something well, make something, you know, make a good story paired with, you know, images that drive that forward. So he made it, you know, it was pretty conventional. Like, we had a meeting, he got a good sense of my work, and he got a good sense of my ability. And then I invited him, like, look, just make a list of where do you want these breaks to happen, and what do you imagine the image being. Give me the manuscript text of what happens before and after, you know, and then we'll look at it. I'll read it. I'll come up with a drawing. And if it's different from your expectation, we'll talk about it, and we'll develop it. And then we'll set it on linoleum. And if there's further edits that could happen, then we could do those digitally. There's very little digital work done to those prints. And I created a body of work. We created a body of work that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
40, I think it was like 45 prints, and I editioned those, and printed them. And I mean, the book is an amazing book. And I was really proud of that work. So it's pretty straightforward, but I think that would be the key. You know, it's just kind of like make that agreement with each other that, you know, the goal of this project is, you know, not necessarily to see who's, you know, just to come together and let's tell a good story, and let's see what pushes that story forward, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I haven't, you know, read the text, but just from the images on your website, they're so evocative of like a sense of place and just that particular form of childhood adventure, I think. And
Oh,
hearing
definitely.
that it's the Huckleberry Finn, or inspired by, or a retelling of Huckleberry Finn, really, makes a lot of sense. And I love that idea of taking that very rural story and placing it in the context of Los Angeles, because of course city kids get into trouble and have adventures and, you know, run into strange characters down by the river as much, if not more so, than country kids, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just, you know, in terms of what we were talking about before, of what was the word in your artist statement, something about dark and uncertain times,
Yeah.
which we've definitely found ourselves in. How have you been responding to 2020? I know that you've been doing some Instagram live sessions chatting with printmakers, which
Yeah.
has been wonderful. And, you know, I don't know if you want to plug that, if you've got more coming or anything, or talk about that, or even just want to talk general about how you find yourself responding to the lockdown or the politics of right now. But yeah.
Uh, uh, yeah, it's been. I mean, I'm just trying to like. It's been a roller coaster for sure.
Mm,
I think 2020 started off being very hopeful.
yeah.
It was supposed to be the year, I had my fiance, well, now my wife, we got married. We had this big wedding plan, and we made
Oh.
a lot of plans, and we everything was like we're both very much planners, and we made
Mm-hmm.
lists and
Mm.
budgets, and and it just kind of like March came around, and we made her save the date, hoping that by September things would be better,
Right.
and just kind of like trying to convince her. We sent those out, and it didn't think things didn't get better. So by June we realized that we had to like reassess everything. But it's kind of been the story with everything. I had to shut down my studio and move my things out. It just didn't become feasible to maintain a studio space if
Yeah.
I can't have it. That's where I would meet clients. That's where I would have print sales. And if I can't have anybody come in right now, well, it's not safe to do.
Yeah.
Then why I can't have the burden of paying that extra rent. So I had to let it go, and that was very hard because it's kind of like, I mean, it felt like cutting off an arm.
I bet.
But then, like we found a new place to live, and I had a garage, and I looked at it, and I was like, oh well, for now it's fine. I could put the press in there, my inks, and we could put the library inside our office, our home office, and so definitely making those adjustments. The beginning was March was hopeful, April, May, June was very scary.
Yeah.
Work dried up. I had to call clients and see like, and just have very real conversations and say like, hey, we had this work planned for 2020. I know that economically things aren't going to be great. I need to have that honest conversation so that I could plan something
Yeah.
and not be just kind of left, hoping. Hope. I think Dr. Fauci said this. Hope is not a good strategy, and he's right. It's not. So I've been kind of like I've had to confront the really, and then like very emotional. Like there was like this term running around, essential worker, and
Mm.
I was like, man, I'm not essential. Like even the guy at the 7-Eleven's essential. I'm like so unessential right now. And I had like, like a bout with depression and saying like, man, I'm trying to sell these prints out of cotton paper, like on like
Mm.
beautifully made, and people are fighting over toilet paper. Like,
Yeah. Oh
like
my
what hope do I
gosh.
have of like, of continuing this? Like maybe I should like give this up and like do something, it was very uncertain. And then it's like, oh my God, I'm trying to marry this person. And like, how am I going to like move
Yeah.
forward, like with our married life and like, financially. And it was, that was a little bit of a panic, but then it's just kind of like things that I've forgotten about just started coming through. Like, I'm going to share it in this podcast. Like I got the green light to share it. So I'm doing, the branding and brand refresh. We're updating the brand for the Aguilar family.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
this is Antonio Aguilar's, the great Don Antonio Aguilar, very much a fixture in our house because his family, he's from the same region as our family.
Mm.
So we always felt like Antonio Aguilar was like an uncle. Like that's how familiar my first live music experience was Antonio Aguilar and his family at the Pico Rivera Sports Arena. And I had put in a proposal in March and I forgotten about it because I didn't hear about it. I thought, well, they're not going to do it. And then I heard in June, and they said, well, they're still interested, but they want to see samples. I sent samples, and now we're in the thick of it. We're pushing the work out, and they're we're I'm very excited to be doing that, and it's very much influenced. I'm not going to reveal too much about. I
Okay.
can't,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
will say that it's very much influenced by the by my practice as a filmmaker.
Mm. Yes.
And by the Mexican printmaking. So we're using that as a way, printmaking as a way to express Mexican identity within their brand.
Mm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
like how do we communicate that graphically? And I proposed this, and they're going for it, and I think it's very exciting work. I think it's gonna really look great, and that kind of like that was like that was it. That was like the life preserver that I needed, and then other things started coming up. Tim DeRoche and I are actually working on another book called Tales of Whimsy versus of Woe. That's the working title, but it's a little different. It's not quite printmaking. I'm actually doing pen and ink illustrations for that one,
Mm.
but it's gonna be like children's poetry, kind of in line with Shel Silverstein, kind of like the silly
Yeah.
limericks and silly like rhymes and verses. So we have that to look forward to early next year, or yeah, probably early next year. We'll be putting that out. So now that that kind of gives me makes me feel better,
Mm-hmm.
but the hopelessness always creeps back in. Like
Mm.
just seeing how people are behaving, how people are kind of like suspicious of like science and suspicious of
Yeah.
like all this stuff. And but you know what? I do have to say this. It's not without reason. I'm not saying that it's right,
Mm.
but like in my neighborhood, they were sterilizing women at the
Right.
county hospital in the up into the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
and without their knowledge. So there's always this distrust because there is a record of these
Yeah.
horrible things happening. But that's not to mean that's not to say that you should throw everything out the window. Like vaccines are a proven way of combating disease. It's the science is there.
It is completely understandable though, because it's, you're
Yeah.
having people tell you like no vaccines are proven, and it's like, well, yeah, like I once had a doctor tell me that I had to have an operation and that was proven,
Hmm.
and then it turns out that this thing was done to me. Like you can't, I mean, I can't begin to conceive of what that experience would be like. And so therefore, I feel like it's completely understandable that someone would put that in the same camp, because it's
Hmm.
like it's just people who are like in authority telling me something about my body, and
Hmm.
why would I trust that ever again? Like it's an unimaginable legacy that the American healthcare system carries is some of that, among many
Yeah.
others, unfortunately. But yeah, that one is in there.
Yeah. So that's kind of like where my headspace has been. Also, like I've been kind of, I've been gardening a lot because
Oh, I
I'm just
love
I'm
that.
just fig- I'm figuring out ways to stay home. And I used to go out. I used to go out so much. I used to go out to I mean, more so than before I met my wife.
Mm.
But even when even when we were dating, we used to go out. We used to love going out and just hanging out in the city, and just going out to see gigs, see music gigs, and going places into restaurants. And it's been hard. It's been hard staying in. I've adjusted to it. Like for me, like I'm having a great old time watching a tomato plant grow. I'm wondering like which blossoms are going to turn into tomatoes and which are just going to fall off. And
Oh my
maybe Epsom
gosh.
salt does work. Like I don't know, crushed eggshells, maybe.
Maybe,
But
yeah.
uh, but 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 yeah, no. Like, so I've been building planters. I've been tilling soil, and whenever I get stuck like with work, I'll just get up and I'm like, man, I'm just gonna go pick at the plants. I'm gonna go smash some aphids or
Yeah,
I don't know, scare the
that's
squirrel away.
that's so yeah, that's a little different than I imagine like the LA music scene. But but I just yeah, I've actually I think that adversity, discomfort, it is always an option for growth. And
Yeah.
and you don't have to be grateful for the crisis, but you can be grateful for the opportunity to grow. And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And so
Hmm.
it's forcing all of us to shift gears and change the way we conceive of ourselves and the way we conceive of what our life looks like. And while, no one could ever call the pandemic a good thing, I think anytime we're doing that as people, we're learning and we're growing and we're becoming stronger. And, learning that as you said, like you can have these things happen and sort of fall into these dark places and these places of fear. And then, every time you come back out of it, every time you get that gig that you'd applied for that you'd forgotten about, or you find like, okay, I don't have a studio anymore, but it's actually okay to work at home. It's like that trust muscle in your brain to trust yourself gets stronger every time. At least that's been my experience, is that
Hmm.
when you find yourself in really dark places, you can be, and even if you can say, to have that little bit of light that's like, I've been here before and I'm still standing. So I'm probably going to do that again, even though it might not feel like that right now.
Right, right. No, no, exactly.
Well, I feel like that's like a beautiful place to wrap up with your new gigs on the horizon and your tending to your tomato plants and and before we sign off entirely, would you please let listeners know where they can find you and follow you and see your work?
Sure. You could always see what I'm up to on Print Gonzalez. My Instagram handle is Print Gonzalez. And also, you can visit my website, www.printgonzalez.com. You can see some of my past work, but my Instagram has more of my recent work.
Beautiful. Well, I will put links to both of those for sure in the show notes for this. And thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with me and being willing to chat with Reinaldo here in just a moment to talk again. And so we get to release this podcast in Spanish and English. So I really appreciate it. And it's just been a delight getting to know you more and getting to know your work more.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for reaching out.
Well, that's our show for this week. Join me again next week when my guest will be Roberta Feoli, a Venice-based printmaker. We talk about non-toxic printmaking, working in a sinking city, traveling for printmaking back when they could do such things, and getting witchy in the studio. You won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing help by Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you next week.